Welcome everyone. This is Stacy Fox from TAC. Today is the second session of the 811 PRA Grantee Startup Training. Our first meeting was on March 12th, which covered a welcome from HUD and an overview of the program. Today we're going to provide a high-level overview of the cooperative agreement and exhibits. We're going to cover a lot of material today, but you have all received a copy of these slides yesterday, and this session is also being recorded so you can review it later. As time allows today, we're also going to take a few questions after each major section, and we'll also leave some time at the end of the training for some additional Q&A. Before we get started, I just want to cover some quick reminders. We have a large number of people on this webinar today, so participants are currently muted. However, if your audio PIN has been entered, I'll be able to unmute you for any questions you'd like to ask verbally during the question portion. And as a reminder, you can enter your audio PIN at any time during today's training by pressing pound, your audio PIN number, pound on your phone's keypad. When you are ready to speak, you can use the raise your hand function in GoToWebinar, which is shown on the screen right now, and I'll know to unmute you. You can also submit written questions at any time during the training by using the questions box, which is also shown on the screen. This slide shows the key HUD, CMS, and TA staff for the PRA program. With us today from HUD are Danielle Garcia, Marvis Hayward, and Katina Washington. And from TAC, we're also joined by Lisa Sloan today. Now, because of the large number of attendees, we're not going to go through an individual roll call. However, I can see that right now we have representation from all 25 awardees that are shown on the screen. And quickly, that includes Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, DC, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, Nevada, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Texas, and Wisconsin. So thanks so much for participating today. I'm now going to turn things over to Marvis Hayward, who's going to kick off our discussion of the cooperative agreement. Marvis?
Thanks, Stacy, and welcome to all of our new grantees and our returning grantees. We're very excited about moving forward and rolling out this round's 811 PRA applications. So I'm going to spend a few minutes providing an overview of the cooperative agreement and discuss the critical relationships before we dive into the details. Basically, the cooperative agreement is one document which also has 12 exhibits that go along with it. The agreement is between the State Housing Agency and HUD. The FY13 cooperative agreement, we expect to issue that in mid-May, shortly after our convening, which is also scheduled sometime in May. And the document will be very similar to what was issued in FY12. And for those who have had the opportunity to go onto the HUD Exchange to pull down that document, you'll be able to see how it does reference the FY13 that's coming out. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the cooperative agreement comes with 12 exhibits. And here you'll see the exhibits that we'll be covering in a bit. We'll go over these in detail during this webinar, but it's Exhibit 1, which is the definitions. Exhibit 2 is the actual NOFA that we use during this funding round. The Exhibit 3, the Interagency Partnership Agreement, grantee program descriptions is Exhibit 4. Program guidelines are found in Exhibit 5, and the budget is in Exhibit 6, which we'll be talking about in greater detail. And Exhibit 7 is the agreement to enter into a rental assistance contract, which we call an ARAC. going on. Exhibit 8 is our rental assistance contract. 9 is also the RAC Part 2. 10 is the use agreement. The model lease is found in Exhibit 11. And Exhibit 12 will be any grantee addendums that your agency will submit along with the cooperative agreement. And as you can see, each one of these forms do have a designated HUD number, form number. Okay, so the documents we are discussing today outline the relationship between the PRA entities involved in the program and their roles and responsibilities. And this slide illustrates the key relationships in the program. Under the PRA program, these agencies have a variety of relationships, most of which are described in the documents we're discussing today. And as you can see here, how the flow goes from the state housing agency to owners and property managers, also to PRA tenants. But also that state housing agency has a relationship with the Medicaid and Human Services agencies. The owners and property managers have a relationship with the community-based service providers, and the tenants as well with the service providers. So they're all interlinked in one way. Next slide. So roles and responsibilities of the grantee. The documents that we're going to be discussing outline the roles and responsibilities of the agencies participating in the PRA program. The grantee's roles and responsibilities include ensuring the program is administered in accordance with the cooperative agreement, to monitor the program implementation, review the owner request for payment, submit vouchers to HUD, report to HUD, participate in an evaluation of the program, and other roles and responsibilities that may be outlined in Exhibit 4, which is your specific interagency partnership agreement. Although you as a grantee can subcontract many of the responsibilities, the grantee will remain accountable for all of these. The state's particular interagency partnership agreement, which is Exhibit 3, will define any other responsibilities, such as who is managing the wait list and the referral process for the state, which could be the state housing services or another agency. And we will talk more about that in a future webinar. Next slide. So here you see some of the roles and responsibilities for the State Human Services Medicaid Agency. And as is listed here, to ensure the services are made available in accordance with Exhibit 4, again, that interagency partnership agreement. I'm sorry, that should be Exhibit 3. That is a typo. And other roles and responsibilities that are outlined in Exhibit 3. And some of those include outreach and referral and the provision of services. All that's in your interagency agreement. Next slide. Some roles and responsibilities of the owner-manager or to provide the PRA units with agreed upon size, access, rent, and utilities. Also to comply with the conditions of the RAC, to ensure that the units are in good condition, and to request rent adjustments annually if needed. Next slide. And here are our tenant responsibilities: to comply with the lease requirements, and also, just as a reminder, their participation in any type of supportive service activity is completely voluntary. It's not a condition of their residency. And there are also instances where a community-based service provider may be involved in this process as well. In most of our grantee states, the community-based service providers primarily have relationships with the tenants providing case management, case coordination, housing supports, skills training, and other variety of services. But in a few states, there's also a separate relationship between the owner and the service provider, which is usually governed by an MOU that outlines the relationship and the services that will be provided. And just again, as a reminder, the services are completely voluntary by the resident. So this community-based service provider makes services available with, as per their agreement, as I said, the MOU, and they can possibly maintain a relationship with the owner through that MOU. Next slide, please. So here you see a matrix which explains, which depicts, I should say, some of the the relationships that would take place between certain parties throughout this program. And as we start to review the cooperative agreement and the exhibits, this matrix will help to illustrate which of these relationships each of the cooperative agreement documents primarily speaks to. For example, you'll see the first line item, Exhibit 3 is the Interagency Partnership Agreement, and this document is between the State Housing Agency and the State Human Services and Medicaid agencies. As you can see, the X on both of those columns. And then as a comparison, if you look down at Exhibit 11, which is the model lease, this primarily illustrates that the terms of the relationship are between the owner-manager and the tenant. And although there are no checked X's, I should say, in the community services provider box, that's primarily because the cooperative agreement does not speak directly to that relationship. However, as we just talked about in the previous slide, that they do play and can play a very important role in the PRA program. Next slide. Okay, let's start with the cooperative agreement, excuse me, which is a contract between a grantee and HUD, as we said. We're going to highlight some of the areas of the agreement, and of course, agencies need to review the particulars in the agreement carefully with your staff. Next slide. Okay, so when you receive the cooperative agreement, Section 1 will be completed with two different numbers, as you can see here. One refers to the rental assistance, which will be used with the voucher submitted for the rental assistance payments, and the other is for the administrative costs that will be drawn down as we go along. Both are 11-digit numbers with a different lettering system in the center of the number, I should say, which symbolizes the purpose. So you'll see the first set of numbers is for the rental assistance, and the letters in the middle are RDD, which refers to the rental assistance. For the cooperative agreement administrative cost number, you'll see the letters in the middle are DRD, which specifically speak to the admin costs. For both sets of numbers, you'll see at the end they have four groups of 4 numbers beginning with 1301, which indicates the year, the 13 indicates the year that it was funded. The first 2 letters in this example are FL, which speaks to the state which received the funding, which is a 2-letter abbreviation for the state. In this case, it would be Florida. So when we go over the rental assistance voucher system in a separate call, you'll see how these numbers will also refer to your RAC contracts. Next slide. Okay, time frames. As you know, the term of the contract is 20 years with an initial funding for 5 years. And then after the initial 5-year period, HUD will provide the grant as may be amended annually or as determined by HUD appropriations. That's subject to appropriations, so each year the appropriations will specifically spell out or provide information on the funding for this program after the first 5 years. Next slide. Okay, here we see the eligible uses of the funds, and basically there's only 2 eligible uses for rental assistance and administrative costs to the grantee. And as was spelled out in the NOFA, and also as you demonstrated in your application, the administrative costs cannot exceed 8% of the rental assistance award. And you can begin incurring your admin costs as of the date of the preliminary award letter, but you cannot bill for them until the cooperative agreement is executed. Now, we are working on the preliminary award letters, and we anticipate they'll be out maybe within a week. Yeah, about a week's time you should be receiving those, and so that will be your date by which you can begin to incur the admin costs. And of course, the total obligation cannot exceed the rental assistance award. Okay, all grantees have been working with the TAC technical assistance leads on their budgets, which will become Exhibit 6 of the cooperative agreement. The discussion with TAC has probably illustrated to you how this fluctuation can occur. In multifamily, this flexibility is unique to the PRA program. And so we'll point out other unique features during our discussion today. But in short, we recognize that the market conditions can fluctuate from the time that you first put this application together until you're ready to actually have folks move into the units. And so therefore there may be a change from what you projected as the total number of units that you were going to make available versus what is actually, reality and what is actually doable. And so this is where we're talking about that the numbers may fluctuate over the 5-year period of award. And within 30 days of the execution of the last RAC, you'll have to provide HUD with confirmation of the final number of assisted units. And then if this number is just totally way off from what was originally projected with a great variance, then we'll need an explanation from you as a grantee. Next slide. So this is kind of a repetitive information here, but as we said, the initial period of funding is for 5 years, and it's subject to the appropriations bill that we receive annually. So, and some additional information is, in the event the agreement is terminated, we will not require the grantee to enforce the RAC or use the agreement. And you as a grantee, at your discretion, will make the decision on whether to enforce or terminate the RACs or use the agreements. Next slide. The grantee has the responsibility to ensure the program is administered in compliance with the cooperative agreement as well as the federal laws and regulations. The cooperative agreement drills down a bit into these grantee responsibilities, and we'll take a few minutes to go over some of these, which you'll see again in some other exhibits. Next slide. Section 15 is speaking about how you will conduct monthly voucher reviews, and you'll adjust the rent and utility allowances when needed, and of course pay the monthly rental assistance subsidies directly to the owners. You as the grantee will be handling this directly. HUD will not be involved with that, with the payment directly to the owners. And then next slide, section, 14, right? The grantee must have the capability to transmit the HUD 50059 and the HUD 52670, that information into tracks and also to be able to receive return messages from tracks. And the grantees, you can do this directly if you have the capability, or you may choose to use a vendor if that's your discretion. We'll also be having a separate, is this a webinar that we're going to be having on our HUD systems?
Maybe.
Yeah, okay.
Or the convening.
Okay.
It will yeah, and it will also be a part of the convening agenda.
Okay. So at our convening tentatively scheduled for mid-May, we will have further discussion regarding that. Okay, and so also within the cooperative agreement there are some definitions. So I'm sure these definitions may not be new to many of you, but just as a reminder what the PBCA, what their role is, and also what a TCA. And you can read this for yourself. I don't need to read this to you. Okay, so at this point, am I turning this over to, who's up next, Stacey?
It's me, actually. So thanks so much, Marvis. Now that you've seen on the screen, and Marvis has talked a little bit about PBCAs and TCAs, we were hoping to poll grantees to find out which one you are. So I'm going to launch a poll, and if you would just take a minute just to respond. So are you, and you're going to pick only one, a PBCA, a TCA, a PBCA, and a TCA, neither a PBCA or TCA, or you're not sure. So I'm going to leave this poll up for about another 30 seconds or so, and then we can see what the results are. Great, I think the answers are winding down, so I'm going to give it another 10 seconds, and then we can close this out. All right, so we're going to share the results. 22% of those on the call today answered that they are a PBCA, 12% answered TCA, 17% answered both a PBCA and a TCA, and 27% are neither a PBCA or TCA, and 22% just aren't sure yet. So thanks so much for answering those questions. You're definitely going to talk more about this with your TAC TA leads if you haven't already. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Katina Washington, who's going to continue the discussion around grantee responsibilities. Katina?
Thank you, Stacey. I see that there's a good mixture of different grantees. So let's continue with grantee responsibilities. I'm going to pick up where Marvis left off. So first, we're going to talk about grantees having adequate security measures, and that you ensure that your staff is appropriately trained to protect the confidentiality of certain records, including but not limited to income and tenancy information of families assisted under the RAC. So and that's included in sections 11 and 26. Next, we're going to talk about section 12, where we get into making sure that you record your use agreement and ensure that the owners use the PR model lease for all assisted units. We're going to discuss these in more detail later on in this webinar. So I'm going to turn it back over to Stacey, where we have another polling question for you guys to answer.
Great. Thanks, Katina. So just one more polling question before we move on with the training. So I'm going to launch it now, but you see it on your screen. And so we want you to answer, the PRA program requires units meet which inspection standards? A, HQS, B, UPCS, C, UPS, or D, none of the above? We'll give you guys 30 seconds or so to answer. And it looks like we have most answers in, so I'm going to close this out. I'm going to share the results. And 33% of you answered HQS, 63% answered UPCS, and 5% answered none of the above. So I'm going to turn things quickly back over to Katina, who's going to give you the correct answer and then talk a little bit more about it. Tina?
Thanks, Stacy. So the correct answer is the Uniform Physical Condition Standards, which is the requirement for the PRA program. You should ensure all your assisted units and other facilities are complying with the terms of the RAC along with the UPCS. You as the grantee should ensure owners are complying with the UPCS at least once every 3 years. This 3-year period should allow for the alignment of the other capital programs in your development with the UPCS. For example, if you have a HUD-assisted property, you're probably used to doing REAC inspections, or if it's public housing units, you're probably used to the HQS inspections. So to align those, we ask that you use the more stringent of the standards. And when you are entering this data into our HUD systems IRMs, we ask that you document the inspections in your property history. Now, if you're a HUD assisted, REAC is already in IRMs, but if you're using USPS or HQS, we want you to document that in your property history, and you'll learn more about what IRMs is and when we discuss the HUD systems. You also want to ensure that you also comply with any other relevant federal and state fair housing statutes and regulations. Next slide, please. Okay. Moving on to Section 15 of the responsibilities, rent increases. Owners must submit a written request to the grantee to obtain an annual increase of the pre-renewal gross rent. And also, each year you must certify residents to verify their income, and the system that you need to use is EIV, the Enterprise Income Verification System. So I'm going to talk a little more detail about the EIV. You see in the slide, you see the link to the HUD website with more information about EIV. So EIV obtains the Social Security and supplemental Social Security income benefits from the Social Security SSA, known as, monthly for monthly employer new hires, which is your W-4. And it also gets your quarterly wage for federal and non-federal employees and the quarterly unemployment data from the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, National Directory of New Hires, which is also referred to as the NDNH. EIV helps reduce the income and rent determination errors and improper payments due to unreported and underreported household income. Generally, owners use EIV to verify their applicants' income information. Some states may have do this a little differently. Grantee or other state agencies doing the income verification may have a service bureau who do the work for their owners on their behalf. So we're open to a variety of ways of implementing this requirement, but there has to be some type of quality control policy in place to ensure alignment with HUD's requirements. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about dispute resolution. Dispute resolution should be, a policy should be in place for residents who have dispute with owners. So that's included in Section 12. Next slide. Now we're going to get in just a little bit of talking about how do you get paid. Our primary grant disbursement system is called ELOCS, Electronic Line of Credit Control System. It's an important part of our program. Later, you'll probably get more information on how to sign up for the ELOCS program, and more information about the forms, which come to us, the PRA staff, and we'll get you signed up for payment. And later on in the webinar, I think we go in a little bit more definition about what is ELOCS. Next slide. Both the administrative costs and the rental assistance are paid through ELOCS. Like I said, we'll cover more in detail at another time. The documentation, the cooperative agreement lays out our expectation of the backup documentation for your administrative payments. Maybe I forgot to mention that the ELOCS system is where you'll receive payments from your rental assistance and your administrative costs. But your administrative costs need to have backup documentation when you submit your voucher. The documentation will come into us, the PRA staff, and we'll review it. But you'll be responsible for maintaining this source of documentation, such as your direct costs, as invoices, receipts, canceled checks, and salary reports, to support all your draw requests for payments for the administrative costs. Documentation must be maintained for at least a period of 3 years after your initial funding cycle, or the date of the last payment in the initial funding cycle, whichever occurred last. Now we're going to open it up for any questions.
Great. Lisa, have any written questions come in?
We do not have any written questions yet. If folks have questions, this would be a good time to throw them into the question box, the chat box. There'll be a couple more times for questions, including at the end. So if you're not sure, why don't we give it another 30 seconds and see if anyone throws anything out. But, oh, here comes a question.
And while Lisa's reading that, remember that if you'd like to ask any verbal questions, just use that raise your hand feature, and I'll know to unmute you. But you can also submit written questions.
Okay, good question. So the administrative fees are not earned fees, but are in fact a reimbursement. Katina or Danielle, for you?
This is Katina. Yes, they are a reimbursement for costs already incurred.
And another question, do we need to do anything to get set up for Section 811 if we are already set up for ELOCS?
Yes, you would need to resubmit your Form HUD 27054 to add a new program area for 811.
Okay.
Hi there, this is Danielle. I just want to also add, you wouldn't need to worry about doing that until you get your final letter from HUD with the cooperative agreement. Within that letter, we'll give you instructions about how to get set up for HUD systems. But at this point in time, right now, it's just, for the purposes of education.
Okay, thank you. Is a separate bank account required for the program?
No. No, we have the ability to coordinate with our CFO in Fort Worth to link up current bank accounts that you have existing with HUD.
Okay. And someone asked if you could elaborate more on the admin payment process steps.
Elaborate more on the payment process steps. So once you, I'm going to go into it briefly so we can move on. You're going to receive more detailed instructions how to sign up for ELOCS. But basically the process is, if you've never had ELOCS, you need to complete the HUD ELOCS form. You would submit it into headquarters. We would review the form, sign off on it, give it to the lock security office. The lock security office will grant you approval. They'll send you instructions of how to access ELOCS. Then you would go into the system, submit it. It's an automatic form. to submit a voucher. Then the voucher would come to us. It will not automatically pay you. What will happen is you'll receive a screen that says that this voucher is in review. Here in headquarters, the PRA staff will review your voucher, and then you would submit to us by email your supporting documentation of your voucher, whatever your invoices. If you have some people do a spreadsheet of all their salary payments, not necessarily sending in each paycheck, but something comprehensive of detailing your direct costs or indirect costs. So you would submit that documentation to us, we would review it, and then we would release the voucher for payment. I hope that answers the question.
Yep, I think that was very clear. Someone asked, how long will it take for HUD to review and approve, and how long will it take for payment to reach us? Once an invoice is submitted, how long will it take for HUD to review and approve, and then payment to reach?
For us, is whenever we receive your documentation, we review it. We don't necessarily have a time frame, how long it will take for us to review it, but payment will happen within 3 days once we release the voucher.
Okay, terrific. I think submitted. That's someone submitted a question that had the word PBCA in it, and it came in at the same time that another question did, so it didn't quite make it. If you want to resubmit that question or raise your hand and be unmuted and ask it verbally, that'd be great, or you can ask it next question period. But other than that, we're done with the written questions. Any raised hands, Stacy?
No, none yet.
Okay. HUD, you guys want to continue?
Yes. Now that we reviewed the basic contract, the cooperative agreement, and gone over the grantee's responsibilities, we're now going to look at the exhibits which are included and are equally important. Many of you have used contracts which the proposal itself becomes part of the contract, but we chose to do a different approach for this for a number of reasons. The primary reason is that we did not want to change or re-sign the cooperative agreement each time there was something of a change, a staffing change, for example, a shift of the number of units in a certain part of your state changes. So we came up with some forms that kind of will have consistency and alignment within the program. Please understand this is a complex program, a new model we're all learning, so instead of attaching your proposal to the cooperative agreement, we're including what we see as critical pieces. That includes your interagency partnership agreement and some other information which we'll discuss shortly. So the Exhibit 1 includes definitions, and this is included at the end of the cooperative agreement about page 21. And you see on the slide, you'll see examples of some of the definitions that we include, a contract administrator or contract rent. These definitions are frequent terms that we use in the program, so familiarize yourself once you receive the cooperative agreement of these terms so you have a better understanding of what we're discussing. Next slide. Exhibit 2, we include the FY 2013 Section 811 PRA NOFA. This is important. Reference resource guide anytime you need to go back and besides looking at the cooperative agreement, you have the NOFA on hand, and read those first before you ask any questions. It's a great resource. Next slide. Exhibit 3 is your interagency partnership agreement, and this was the threshold requirement when you submitted your application for the FY13 NOFA. And in the agreement, you was outlined your core aspects of your program, including your target population to be served, outreach and referral methods for reaching the target population, and your supportive service commitments for tenants. Changes to this agreement related to target population or appropriate services needs to be made available to tenants, and it also requires HUD consent. Next slide. Exhibit 4 is the grantee program description. It's a 2-page form that identifies the following based on this information was based on your application, and includes the grantee and the primary contact for your program, your state Medicaid agency, the grant amount, the total PRA assisted units, types of projects to be selected, leveraging from the application, and your target population. As we discussed previously, we do not want to keep re-signing the agreement every time there's a change from the original application. So Exhibit 4 kind of outlines your critical elements of your program, and changes to these items must be discussed with HUD. Now, Exhibit 5 includes the program guidelines. The PRA program, as of yet, does not have regulations. We did put out a draft that some people have made comments on, but we do not have any program regulations as of yet. These guidelines are therefore critical and very important for you to review, understand them, ask questions if need be. You will see the same requirements in the other documents such as the RAC. In some cases, there is more detail about the programmatic requirements. Guidelines are divided into actually 4 sections, which we'll highlight the 3 form of each of these sections. The first section is just your summary and applicability, which includes the general program information and the definitions. And the other 3 sections are your grantee requirements, the rental assistance contract, the RAC, and owner requirements. So now we're going to discuss some of the grantee requirements. First, let's start with the Affirmative Furthering Fair Housing Marketing Plan. Grantees, you will be responsible for developing your Affirmative Fair Marketing Plan and submitting the plan for approval. The plan must provide information and otherwise attract eligible persons to the program regardless of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, familial status, who are not likely to apply to the program without special outreach. Please be advised that there's only one plan per state. So you need to work with, if you work with your, within your state to get one plan submitted to HUD. Each grantee must conduct affirmative fair housing outreach activities specific to their target population. Your outreach and referral must be sufficient to reach all eligible persons in your target population. Your methods for outreach and referrals and your proposals should reasonably reach eligible persons within your demographic, within your targeted population. But if you're unable to through these methods, you would need to identify those who would, as I said earlier, as those who are least likely to apply. We do have a affirmative marketing plan form and instructions. These will be provided to you, and we will discuss these in more detail at the convening, and likely we'll have the fair housing staff on hand for any questions or concerns that you have in your drafting your affirmatively furthering fair housing marketing plan. Now let's move on to effective communication. This is one area which the FY12 grantees had questions, including the effective communication. You want to ensure that your program is equally accessible to persons with communication disabilities, such as maybe a hearing or visual disability. For example, if your outreach is being communicated like via radio, you want to ensure that those people with hearing impairments or who are deaf wouldn't be at a disadvantage in learning about the PRA program. If all your outreaches via newsletter or newspaper advertising in traditional papers, then persons with visual disabilities would be at advantage. So you want to ensure your communication is effective in reaching people with any kind of hearing, visual, or other communication-related disabilities. And make sure that this effective communication is consistent with the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the ADA, your American Disabilities Act. Now we want to discuss your Davis-Bacon standards. The Davis-Bacon requirements do apply to the PRA program. The threshold for the program is 12 units. Many of your other developments may have other federal funds. Davis-Bacon requirements are not additive. That means they're not, you can't add the units together and come up with the threshold, but the lowest threshold does apply. We have an example of what we mean by thresholds are not additive. For example, if you have 6 PRA units and 10 home units, the threshold for both the PRA and the home units is 12. So in that instance, your Davis-Bacon standards wouldn't apply for this development. Next slide. Now we're just going to briefly go over environmental requirements. Environment is one of the areas in which HUD has the most questions, in which we have been the most flexible in accommodating the different state requirements as it relates to environmental. And it's important to know that neither Part 50 or 58 of the regulations, but a variation of these accommodate PRA. All HUD-assisted properties are presumed to meet these environmental tenets. Second, if a Phase 1 has already been conducted for the property, was done when the transaction occurred, and to the standards in the PRA guidelines, it does not have to be conducted again. So if you already conducted a Phase 1, you don't have to conduct them again. Further, in the requirements state that there are alternatives to conducting a Phase 1 to comply with the environmental requirements. So if you look at the cooperative agreement, you'll see more information about the environmental requirements, and don't hesitate to ask us any questions about it. So that concludes my portion of this webinar. We're going to turn it over to Danielle, who's going to discuss the rental assistance contract, the RAC.
Hi, thanks, Katina, and good afternoon, everybody. So still focused within the cooperative agreement, and we're still within the program guidelines of the exhibit to the cooperative agreement. As Katina went over high level within the program guidelines, all of the grantee requirements, or at least high level of the major requirements. I'm going to go over 2 other parts within the program guidelines, and one is the RAC, and then the other are owner requirements. And next slide. Thank you. So the RAC stands for Rental Assistance Contract. It's essentially the contract between the grantee and the owner. The RAC, we've developed 2 different HUD form numbers, and they're listed on the slide, and they're basically very similar to a HAP contract, which is a housing assistance payment. It has 2 parts, Part 1 and Part 2, and to make matters more confusing, these RACs are part of exhibits within the cooperative agreement. So later down in the presentation, we're going to show the RAC Part 1 is Exhibit 8 of your cooperative agreement, and the RAC Part 2 is Exhibit 9 of your cooperative agreement. Essentially, the RAC sets forth your requirements and duties for the owners and the grantee in respect to the units that we're providing assistance to. And it's your job as the grantee to enforce the RAC with owners during the term of the contract. Next slide. One of the PRA guidelines, PRA .301, is regard to vacancy payments. This is also detailed in the RAC contract. The form of vacancy payments is essentially a form of a special claim. Vacancy payments are allowed under this program but they may not exceed 80% of the contract rent for up to 60 days. As you're structuring your program, you can decide whether or not you want to allow vacancy payments within your program. It's essentially balls in your court. Another form of special claims that is provided in other HUD programs is cost of damages. Now, this form of special claim is not an allowable payment for our program, so just keep that in mind. We're just approving payments for vacancy payments. And PRA point 303 is a section in regard to leasing to eligible tenants. So your grantees or your servicing partners will conduct the tenant selection and essentially make the referral to the owners. The next process is the owner screens the applicants. Essentially, they would be doing the criminal screening, sex offender screening, and any other allowable screenings within HUD guidelines. Grantees will then increase and decrease the number of units in the rack if you cannot lease the units. Now, this is actually a big win for us because this shows how flexible we are for the program. So basically, I guess theoretically, you can have a 10-unit rack with an owner, and over time, say the units are sitting vacant, you can essentially amend the unit count on the rack to decrease if, say, the property just wasn't in the right market you initially thought, it's a bad location. You may have a few residents under that rack, but this allows us to give you flexibility to adjust units up or down depending how the market goes within the future. And further on, when we go into the rack, I'm going to show you the Exhibit 1 of the rack where you would essentially do that amendment. PRA 305 is limitation on assisted units. Here, units receiving a form of federal or state rental assistance for a period of 6 months or more are ineligible unless the payment is being used to support other units at the property without restrictions. So an example would be is if you have a partially assisted Section 8 project-based property, that may be okay because your property is not fully assisted, so you have some non-Section 8 units that are not assisted and essentially are eligible to receive PRA assistance. Units with use agreements requiring housing for persons 62 or older are not eligible under this program. And no more than 25% of total units within the property can be restricted to supportive housing for persons with disabilities or have any occupancy preference for persons with disabilities. So an example for this is if you have an owner with a preference of persons with disabilities, say their preference is 10% of total units. Then as you're working your conversations with the owner to get them on the program, what that means essentially is your max amount of PRA units that can be allowable, since this program is for persons with disabilities, would be 15%. And through statute, you would meet that requirement of not exceeding the 25% threshold. There is no minimum of number of units that a PRA unit can be at a property, but there is this maximum of 25%. And the final section of program guidelines is going to go over the owner requirements here. So owner responsibilities. The owner is responsible for all management functions, so this includes screening the applicants, in accordance with your your grantee-approved tenant selection plan. They're going to be processing all the certifications in TRACS, which is a HUD systems for rental assistance, essentially processing your move-in certification, your interims, annual research, move-out certs, and so on. The owner is responsible for determining family rent and collection of rent, and essentially also termination of tenancy and eviction if that were to happen. The owner must also repair and perform maintenance functions on site. Now, in regard to occupancy standards, PRA is following multifamily guidelines, and if there is a change in family size after initial occupancy, then the owner will have to follow your TSP policies regarding occupancy standards and waitlist transfers. Rental assistance payments with respect to assisted units will not be reduced or terminated until an eligible family has been transferred to an appropriate sized unit. And whenever a grantee is, basically the next bullet point here says the grantee grantee should be notified change in family size. The big picture behind that is you guys are the ones managing the wait list. So if the owner is working with the resident to do a unit transfer, it's very important that they coordinate with you, because you eventually are going to be getting you referrals to the vacant units. Another point is that if you guys pull up the 4350.3, section 3-23G2 has a good description of move-in requirements at initial occupancy, and basically points out that a single person cannot occupy a unit with 2 bedrooms or more unless they follow guidelines within this section of the handbook. So an example to make an exception would be if the applicant needs a larger unit as a reasonable accommodation. So if they had a live-in aid or had medical equipment for a larger bedroom, then that would be allowable at initial occupancy. And Katina went over the UPCS standards. This is a requirement for PRA. Just to clarify, though, we do not accept HQS inspections, so the minimum requirement would be the UPCS standards. And here we will open it up for questions before we continue on with the exhibits.
Okay, and we have a bunch of questions. First question is, do we have a choice to use a TCA or a PBCA?
And I'm assuming that that question refers to somebody who's not a PBC or TCA, but no, the ball's in your court. So if you need to contract out services to complete a fully functional program, then you can do so.
Great. Another question. This program is subject to the LEP, or Limited English Proficiency Requirements, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And people will hear more about that as they hear more about the marketing, affirmative fair housing marketing plans.
Yes, and Marvis also mentioned that it is also in the NOFA.
Okay, great. Is the grantee or the human services, their human services partner, responsible for ensuring that all communications are effective?
Yes, it would be responsible of the grantee. And essentially, HUD's contract is with the State Housing Finance Agency, so if there's ever any concerns, we would go straight to the grantee.
Mm-hmm. But you're also saying it's the grantee's responsibility to make sure its whole program is accessible. So if they've subcontracted or something, that piece of the program would need to also make sure it had effective communication, correct?
Right. Yes. Thanks, Lisa.
Last question. Well, there may be some more. I have to look. But one more question for now is Davis-Bacon. I think there's a little confusion. If something is existing housing, does Davis-Bacon apply, or only if new construction or rehab?
Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, and Marvis also, but it does apply. The minimum threshold would be the 12 count for PRA units.
Yep, but I only think if you're doing new construction or rehab. If you're an existing building and you're not doing any work on it, Davis-Bacon is all about hiring, paying wages during the construction and rehab process. So it applies, but not to existing housing with no rehab.
Good point. Thanks. Yes, Lisa, this is Katina. That is correct.
Okay. Can the grantee set a minimum number of PRA units?
A minimum number, you can set whatever you'd like, as long as it does not exceed the 25% threshold. So if you're setting a minimum number of units, that's fine. But if you're working with, say, some small owners, you just want to make sure you don't exceed the max.
One part of the Cranston-Gonzalez list says that the program is for people 18 to 61. Another section says disabilities must arise before age 22. So I think there's confusion. What are the age requirements for this program?
At move-in, the age requirement is 18 to 61.
Okay. So that is the overarching requirement. Anybody in that age category that has a disability, regardless of when it arose, whether as a child or as an adult, would be eligible. Would state funding of residential costs, rent, utilities, and apartment or house be considered state-supported housing and therefore ineligible?
Can you repeat that question again, Lisa?
Yes. Would state funding of residential costs in an apartment or house, so if a program, if somehow an apartment is already getting state money that covers rent and utilities, would that be considered ineligible for the program?
Lisa,
Like,
you want to take a stab at that? I want to say I have an inkling to the answer, but feel free to chime in here.
So you're going to chime in?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. It seems to me that it would fit under the limitations, that it would not be eligible, that it doesn't matter if it's state funded or federally funded. If it's been 6 months or more of rental assistance, it's not eligible for the program.
That sounds about right to me.
Okay. Whoever asked that question, if you want to explore it further, this would be starting with your TA lead would be one way to do that. There's a question about the inspection requirements. Regarding UPCS, the PRA units must meet UPCS, but the project is not subject to an actual REAC inspection, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, typically REACs are for HUD-assisted properties. We're just requiring you to follow the UPCS standard.
Okay, I'm just looking through the list to see if I missed anything. Stacy, any hands up?
None at this time, but it might be a good reminder. So if you do raise your hand and want to come off mute, just remember that you need to enter your audio PIN because we're recording this session. And you can enter that at any time by pressing pound, your audio PIN number, and pound on your phone's keypad.
I think we're ready to move forward with the other slides.
Okay, great. So continuing on with the exhibits of the cooperative agreement, Exhibit 6 is your budget. All of you have been working with your TAC TA lead on updating and clarifying your budgets that were submitted with the NOFA. Most of you should have those to TAC and to HUD today. And I hope you found that the Exhibit 6 spreadsheet was a little more user-friendly and a little more visually appealing than the budget you had to submit with your application. And the next slide shows the budget that you have been working on. So for those folks who are not the housing folks, you can take a look at what we're asking here. But essentially, you're estimating the number of PRA units, the contract rent, and showing HUD what your schedule ramp-up will be over the course of the funding period. Now, Exhibit 7, we did briefly go over this. This is the agreement to enter into your rental assistance contract. This is an ARAC. It has its own designated form. Typically, this particular ARAC, this contract will be for new constructions, properties, or properties going substantial rehab. You may have an owner or developer ready to commit to the program, and you are eager and excited that they are. So you would essentially have them execute the ARAC, and once the property is ready to start the actual contract, which is the RAC contract, you would execute at a later date. And the Exhibit 8 of the cooperative agreement is the RAC Part 1. So this is also a different form number, 92235. Part 1 describes kind of big picture of the program. It talks about that it's a 20-year contract with the grantee and the owner. Part 1 also includes your contract term, which is the 20 years, the number of assisted units, number of bedrooms, contract rent, your utility allowance, and the gross rent established at the site. And within the RAC Part 1, there are exhibits to the RAC. So this next slide shows the Exhibit 1, which is your schedule of contract units and contract rents. This is essentially your initial rent setting that you're going to be establishing with the owner. Previously, I'd mentioned a huge deal for our program is that you have flexibility to adjust the unit count at the site level to kind of make sure that all your units are utilized effectively. So this little box in the middle part, you would fill this particular exhibit out whenever you need to adjust your unit configuration at a particular site. During your initial rack execution, you will not fill out that box. You're just going to fill out everything else surrounding it. But this is essentially how you're doing your initial rents. I can say part of something that was different from the first round to this round, there will be a change to this part of the rack that we're incorporating right now. Essentially, we gave, under this new NOFA, a lot more flexibility to set your initial rents with percentages of AMI. So we need to have a way to document if you did have that commitment in your application, you essentially need to meet it. So we need to find a way to document it. So this will be part of the revisions that we're working on with this next round of folks. And this next slide is the rent and utility schedule. It's often referred to as a rent schedule. It's HUD Form 92458. Essentially, the contract rent, the utility allowance, and the number of units have to match the Exhibit 1 on the rack Part 1 as you're executing this. The rent schedule also identifies items included in rent, such as equipment, furnishing at the site, is there a dishwasher, range, refrigerator, any types of owner-paid utilities. So if the owner pays water, sewer, heating, cooling, and that's included in rent that the resident is not paying, and any other services facilities that's on the site, so parking, laundry room, etc. And this particular form, you will also use it when you're doing your annual rent adjustments with the owner. This is the form that you, as the grantee, will essentially approve to move forward with the gross rent. Now, your initial rent setting, under no circumstance may the initial rack rent exceed your Section 8 FMRs as determined by HUD. This next part, and kind of midway in the bullet, shows a lot of flexibility that we've given you. Unless, so essentially saying if your rents are exceeding FMRs with HUD approval, then you can have a market study prepared in accordance with requirements of your state housing agency. So that's pretty much new to HUD. Typically, HUD has a very stringent policy with market studies to where we follow Chapter 9 of the Section 8 Renewal Guide. So you have to go out, long process, follow everything in that chapter. But if you as a state housing agency have your own policy for establishing market studies, and the reason for this flexibility is a lot of you are working with tax credit properties, so you already have market studies in place. So it's a matter of getting your policy written and acceptable in HUD's fashion. And in cases where the initial rack rent exceeds your FMRs, then Exhibit 1 needs to identify your initial rent setting and how they were determined and approved by HUD. So rack Part 1 has an Exhibit 2. It's basically just a one-pager, and it identifies the owner info, the owner's TIN number, the owner DUNS number, management agent info, so, you know, a little more detail about the property, and this is just more for HUD staff to look at that one-pager and enter in the data into IREM. So some other exhibits within the RAC Part 1 are Exhibit 3, which is your grantee affirmative fair housing marketing plan. Exhibit 4 is the use agreement, which is executed, and we'll go over this here in a later slide. That's executed with the owner and the grantee. Exhibit 5 is the lease. That way the owner knows what lease that they're required to use, and we have created our own lease for the program. Exhibit 6 is your program definitions. This is in the cooperative agreement, and it's Exhibit 1 of the cooperative agreement. And Exhibit 7 are program guidelines, and this is in the cooperative agreement referring to Exhibit 5. And here we can open it up for some more questions.
And we do have a question. Can we begin executing ARACs before we have a fully executed cooperative agreement, but after we receive our preliminary award letters?
That's a good question, and Marvis mentioned that that's a very ambitious grantee. I would suggest no, only because I would suggest starting those conversations with owners. You can't really get a developer to commit if you don't have a signed cooperative agreement. So once you're fully ready to sign that cooperative agreement, that's kind of when the clock starts, where you should start executing your documents. But definitely, I can speak from experience. I think all of us can, who are repeat folks and the program staff who worked on the property first round. I think having those conversations are very important. That way you do meet your ramp up that you're projecting in your budget. So start those conversations early. So that's a great idea.
Terrific. I think we have another one. Can grantees allow different rental assistance levels for the same unit depending on the tenant type, such as
You want to repeat that again, Lisa? I'm sorry.
Can there be, I'll just simplify it a little bit, can you have different rental assistance amounts or different rental assistance amounts for different units? I think that...
Well, if I understand the question correctly, at initial rent setting, you are going to establish your rents for the unit type. So if you have a one-bedroom, you're saying the market, below SMRs, no market studies done, is $500. So the rental assistance covers the difference from the tenant payment of that contract rent. So yes, throughout units, the rental assistance, which is based on tenant income, will fluctuate. But if the question is specific to having different contract rents at different unit types, that's acceptable also, but you would have to have a reasoning to establish that initial rent setting. So if you have different one-bedrooms who maybe have different square footage, so that would entitle a higher market rent for a larger unit, then that's acceptable.
Right, but there are reasons that wouldn't be acceptable. For example, you couldn't charge more for somebody with a different rents to people with different kinds of disabilities. That would be, for example, considered discrimination.
Right.
Another question, if a market study is done to set the rent above Section 8 FMR, will the study have to be reviewed by a third-party appraiser?
No, so you would have to have a written policy at the state housing agency. So if you want your written policy to have that similar to what traditional HUD programs do, then that's your call.
Okay. Let me just see if there are any others. Any hands, Stacy?
Checking right now. And none at this time.
Nope. I think you can keep going.
Okay, perfect. So continuing on as far as the cooperative agreement, Exhibit 9 is your rental assistance contract Part 2. We again have a different HUD form number for that. And this kind of Part 2 of the RAC dips into more of the weeds of the owner requirements under a RAC. So the owner will know about the requirement for security deposits, how rental payments will be made, utility allowances, the issue of vacancy payments, annual rent adjustments are required, and then the termination of tenancy. Exhibit 10 of the cooperative agreement is our use agreement. Again, another HUD form. This agreement is signed by the owner and the grantee. This term is 30 years. This is different from the RAC term. So the RAC term is 20 years. The use agreement is 30. And you want to make sure as the grantee that you're reviewing any existing regulation agreement or any regulatory agreements, and so if there's any existing use agreements at a site, make sure that our use agreement does not conflict. And you want to make sure that the owner is a good fit for the program. And Exhibit 11 is our PRA model lease. It's a standard lease between the resident and the owner, and it outlines all of the lease requirements and responsibilities. Exhibit 12 is a grantee addendum. Not all states will have this Exhibit 12. This is generally just used if there's any conflicts as you're reading the cooperative agreement. if your legal department sees that there is conflicts with state or federal laws. A good example is our requirement for security deposits. If there's anything else that you feel is conflicting that you want to change contractually, then we would execute an Exhibit 12 within your cooperative agreement. And here we're starting to wrap up here, but we're showing you the other resources. I'm hopeful that most of you have signed up on our listserv on HUD Exchange. There's a lot of good information on that website. It has all of our material that we've generated. So we do have a HUD notice 2013-32. That's our occupancy notice, and the HUD handbook 4350.3. And the mini site for HUD Exchange does have some FAQs. Right now it's memory serves just in a Word document, but we are looking to get it a little more user-friendly, ramped up, where it's more of a searchable within the website itself. And here we can open it up for more questions.
And we have one about the affirmative marketing plan. Someone looked for it online, couldn't find it on your website, HUD Clips, and will you be issuing that at a later date? The HUD 92243 PRA, the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan.
Yes, we will. Right now the form is actually going through, it was sent to OMB as a draft, so we are working on getting the final approval. And in that matter, all the forms that we've issued were sent to OMB as a draft. But we are planning, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're going to discuss the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan in our next webinar next week.
I believe so.
Yes, and so we will introduce the instructions to you along with the form number that we've created for the program.
Someone was wondering, and this is for Stacy, how can they get a link to listen to this workshop later?
So tomorrow you'll receive a follow-up email from me with a link to the recording.
Terrific. Let's see. Oh, I got a couple more. What happens if the owner forecloses or sells prior to the 30th year?
I'm not sure.
We have our use agreement specialist. I don't know if Charlene's on and she wants to wave to Stacy, she might be able to talk about this a little bit. But I think the way the guidelines read, if it's sold, it goes to the new owner. I mean, it's a use agreement. It's an agreement part of the deal. I'm not sure about foreclosure.
And Lisa, actually, so Charlene, you're unmuted. You can speak now if you'd like.
Hi. I believe that what the cooperative agreement and the negotiations that happened with the FY12 grantees came up with was that it survives foreclosure, it survives sale, but if the housing finance agency and the owner agree that they no longer want the units, the housing finance agency can cancel out the RAC. So I imagine that would be part of a negotiation. Does that sound right to you, Danielle?
Yes, that does sound right. And that also brings out another point of the flexibility is that in addition to increasing, decreasing the number of units on a rack, there is the flexibility if just say the property is not a good fit for the program, not necessarily that the owner wants to opt out. We do not accept opt-outs. But if just you can't get the units at a property and you want to entertain other owners with getting those units housed, then you can terminate a rack and in that regard. So yes.
Okay, and it is in the guidelines, PRA .311 to take a look at, and those are online. Thank you very much. What happens to what happens to the service agreement? I'm not sure what question that's connected to. I'm sorry. Maybe somebody wants to raise their hand.
Actually, so we do have a raised hand. I'm not sure if
Great. Let's go for that.
But Sim Stokes, I'm going to take you off mute. Sim, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi. Feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, I have a situation where I have a project that it's under one service coordinator grant, and then it's covering 4 projects, and then 2 of the projects are under some type of foreclosure or bankruptcy. So I wanted to see if you could comment on that situation, like just in terms of what should happen to what should happen to the cooperative agreement covering those projects.
But that is not under this program. That's under the service coordinator program, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure if these folks can answer that. The person who manages that program isn't here. I'm not sure if that's something within your purview or not.
So the person who manages that program is Carissa Janis.
Okay. No, I was just curious.
Yeah, so you should direct, your question directly to Carissa.
Okay.
If you want to send if you don't have her email address and you want to send Marvis the email, she can forward it to Carissa to reach back out to you.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Please clarify the difference between the 20-year RAC and the 30-year requirement.
That's a great question. So these requirements are through legislation. So through statute, we have to, this is kind of what we were told we had to do, but the concept is we want this program to continue. So if you have an owner exceeds the 20 years, we would love to do a renewal if we have funding for it for a longer term. So eventually we would like those to align, but it wasn't something we just came up with here at HUD.
Low-income housing tax credit property owners can, quote-unquote, opt out of the tax credit program at year 15 via the qualified contract program. Can that justify the grantee allowing them out of the use agreement?
No, the terms of the agreements are pretty much set in stone. As we mentioned earlier, owners cannot opt out because they no longer want to participate. You would have to continue the term of your contract and the use agreement.
Okay. Stacy, any hands?
None at this time, Lisa.
Okay. No more new questions unless someone sends one in now? Or better yet, raise your hand. Nope.
Give it 1 second, Lisa. I'm just going to check the hand.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple of questions. I just want people to know that I've seen a couple of questions that I know fit better for next week, so I'm saving them. Moderator's prerogative.
And there are no hands raised, Lisa.
Okay.
Great. So if more questions come in, Lisa, you can interrupt me. But thanks, everyone, for participating today. On this slide, you can see that we have 2 training sessions left. The next will be April 9th at 3 Eastern. And on that one, we're going to cover some of the startup activities. Following the April 9th training, the next one will be on April 30th. And that one's going to focus on your reporting requirements. And then, as Danielle, Marvis, and Katina have mentioned, we have a tentative convening planned for May 13th and 14th. And you should be receiving more information on that soon. Any questions come in yet, Lisa?
Nope. No additional questions.
All right. Once again, here's the slide with all of the key points of contact, including Danielle, Marvis, Katina, Lisa, and myself. So you can feel free to reach out to us with any questions. You can also, it's probably best if you start with your TAP TA lead, who you've all had discussions with probably last week or this week. Danielle, Marvis, Katina, would you like to Say anything in closing?
Just wanted to say thank you for everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to have you on board and part of our team, and we're eager to get the program up and running in your states just as you are. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.